The vaults of Fallout are some of its most iconic and infamous locations, known across the wasteland for both their highly advanced technology and their highly questionable operation. Publicly marketed as a foolproof way to survive the looming nuclear war, many of them were actually designed to perform cruel social experiments on their inhabitants with truly nightmarish results. These are the 10 worst vaults in Fallout. One of the more unusual vaults in the series, Vault 77, was designed and built for only one occupant who would live out his days in total isolation. The worst part was, the unnamed dweller thought he'd be sharing a shelter with a thriving community. Once the great gear-shaped door slammed closed, it was too late. Desperate for human companionship and slowly losing his grip on reality, the lone resident of Vault 77 spent over a year trapped in isolation. One day, he stumbled upon a sealed government crate labeled P13XUS government issue puppet ration. Inside, he found a collection of puppets, a dog he named Reverend Hound, a grandma, and a king. With no one else to talk to, he began using them to hold conversations, giving each a distinct personality and role in a little make-believe community. Over time, these characters became all too real to him, and the dweller's fractured mind began to divide itself among them. Months later, he discovered one last puppet he had somehow missed before, a vault boy. That's when things took a much darker turn. One day, the king puppet was found murdered, its head ripped off. The dweller demanded to know who was responsible, and in his delusion, the vault boy puppet confessed, claiming that he and the dweller had done it together. Realizing what this meant, that he and his own creation were now accomplices, the dweller's final grip on sanity snapped. Convinced that Reverend Hound would come for them both, he opened the vault door and fled into the wasteland, leaving behind the puppets and whatever was left of his mind. He was picked up by slavers pretty quickly and pleaded with them to run, saying he had no idea what Vault Boy would do next. Those 3 men became the dweller's first real victims, his puppet finally satisfying its growing bloodlust. Now he roams the wastes, his mind forever scarred by his time in that isolated vault, while being led by the very manifestation of his darkest urges, jammed, smiling over his own right hand. Though Vault 11 didn't isolate its dwellers like 77, it instead was built to pit them against each other. After the bombs dropped and the doors sealed against the devastation outside, the Vault Tech assigned Overseer gathered them all in the atrium and announced the Vault's experiment. Every year, they would have to send one of their own into the mysterious tunnel below the Overseer's office, sacrificing them to the Vault itself. If they didn't, the automated systems would kill them all. Enraged, the dwellers forced their Overseer into the tunnel as the first sacrifice. After that point, it became tradition for the position of Overseer to only last for a single year, at the end of which they'd be banished to the tunnel, never to return. Political blocs formed, each trying to nominate the Vault's most hated members for the position of Overseer, gaining more and more power over the population. These blocs manipulated every part of Vault life, as stepping out of line or standing up against them could result in a nomination for Overseer and inevitable death by the ironically named Justice Bloc. In the end, there was no justice for Vault 11, with the last Overseer outlawing the vote, replacing it with an automated lottery. Terrified of losing their power, the blocks exploded into full-scale rebellion, with the fighting claiming the lives of all but 5 of 11's inhabitants. When these final survivors refused to sacrifice anyone else to the now devastated Vault, they were not met by a plume of nerve gas or murderous robots, and were instead met with a cheery message congratulating them on their selflessness while unsealing the doors. Only one of the 5 fled out into the wasteland to warn others of the Vault's horrors, with the other 4 too broken to go on. Their skeletons still lie in the entryway, an empty 10mm between them. Built under Malden Middle School, Vault 75 was heavily advertised to students and their families, and when the bombs dropped, they were filled to capacity. Unfortunately for those who escaped the hellfire above, their prospects weren't much better underground. While the students were ushered into their new living quarters, the adults were led away to a distant corner of the facility before being massacred by the security staff. For their upcoming experiments, the Vault needed only the youngest and most impressionable test subjects. In the century that followed, the kids were subjected to a never-ending battery of genetic, chemical, and behavioral experiments designed to sharpen their bodies and minds. When they reached the ripe old age of 18, they'd graduate the program and be turned loose on the surface. At least, that's what they all thought. In truth, the best of the best would be harvested for their genetic material and used as a basis for the next generation or forced into service with the science team overseeing the grisly process. Those who fell below the exacting standards would simply be incinerated. And so the cycle went on, with children being pushed to their limits, poked, prodded, and experimented on, with their only reward being an unceremonious end or an opportunity to become the tormentors themselves. There's some evidence in the ancient computer terminals of a breakout plan forming led by one of the guilty science team members, but its fate is ultimately unknown. To live, generation after generation, as nothing more than human cattle is a truly nightmarish prospect, and one can only hope that the poor residents of Vault 75, now long abandoned, managed to finally break the vicious cycle. Buried deep within the mountains of Appalachia, Vault 51 was supposed to be run by a Zax supercomputer instead of a flesh and blood overseer. It was tasked with managing the facility as well as selecting the leadership of the vault. After several failed rounds of voting, one dweller named Robert Baker made a fatal mistake. He suggested to the machine that the best leaders arise in times of crisis. Taking this literally, Zax decided that in order to fulfill its directive of selecting the perfect leader, it would have to create its own crises within the vault, sabotaging both the shelter systems and the relationships between vault dwellers. Extremely loud, blaring alarms at random intervals, an engineered food shortage, and the relocation of certain dwellers to cramped, filthy bunks dialed up everyone's stress to 11. At the same time, Zax subtly influenced people's relationships, encouraging cheating with a web of conflicting romantic relationships and rivalries, eventually leading to fights and even fatalities. One explosive confrontation left 4 lovers dead after they tore one another apart under Zax's watchful eye. Needless to say, these crises eventually left only one contender for leadership, a dweller named Ruben, who escaped the now decaying vault, leaving Zax as 51's last occupant still searching for that perfect leader. Moving to the Mojave Wasteland, Vault 19 was designed to create an oppressive feeling of paranoia with all of its vault residents through extremely subtle but persistent means. To start with, it had a very unusual layout. The residents were divided into red and blue sectors, each with their own population and overseer, while being forced to share critical facilities. Once everyone was settled in, the vault began to malfunction in strange ways. Vents would blow concentrated gusts of air in strange patterns, lights would blink in rhythms, and objects would disappear at random, only to reappear in another location. The Reds and Blues both suspected the other side of tampering with the vault's systems, but as their collective paranoia deepened, they even started suspecting the neutral vault doctor and even their own friends and families. No one knows what happened to the vault in the end, but it's likely that they either turned on one another when the crushing weight of their own suspicion became too great to bear. Any survivors have long since drifted off into the desert, never knowing the simple techniques used to break them. The horrible truth behind Vault 12 is one of the most straightforward but also the most terrifying. The vault below the city of Bakersfield was advertised as one of the most secure of all Vault-Tech's offerings, but in a cruel twist of irony was designed to be one of the least. It lacked all of the standard radiation shielding that most shelters were equipped with, and the Great Door, the most iconic feature of every vault, was designed to remain jammed open. When the bombs dropped, radiation blasted down on the defenseless vault, mingling with the foul gas from the Bakersfield sewers as a stinking, rotten, deadly wave. Many succumbed to agonizing cancers and radiation burns, but still more slowly ghoulified, their skin and flesh peeling off their bones while they were still alive. So intense was the radiation that those in the lowest levels started to glow with unearthly light. There were survivors, but truth be told, many of them wished they had died to the invisible killer that swept through the halls of 12. Some of them shambled off into the wastes, but most stayed, creating the city of Necropolis. With the aging, rundown vault still providing the Ghoul City fresh water through its rare water chip, the victims of Vault 12's vile experiment are forever shackled to its own rotting corpse. Designed to protect the top musical talent of the United States, along with their priceless instruments, Vault 92 had the secondary objective of testing the use of white noise and subliminal messaging on its residents. Day in and day out, the constant, low-level drone of the noise spread to every nook and cranny of the vault. The common areas, cafeterias, bedrooms, they couldn't escape it. Finally, some of them started to snap, being driven into mindless, violent rages, displaying nearly inhuman strength and resilience as they tore their fellow dwellers limb from limb. One musician, previously a mild-mannered man, was shot 23 times before his frothing and thrashing body finally went still. More and more of these people succumbed as the noise kept washing over them, with those unaffected desperately fighting back against their frenzied former friends, driven mad by the vault's experiment. And so a war was waged underground, out of sight of the wasteland, until the only survivors of Vault 92 were the bloodstained instruments, with no one left to play them. Not initially designed as a social experiment, Vault 22 was supposed to research hardy strains of crops and other vegetation that could survive in the harsh wasteland. Even this innocent goal in a classic Fallout moment quickly spiraled into a downright terrifying scenario. While experimenting on a type of fungus designed to kill pests, the scientists overseeing its development did a little too good of a job enhancing its deadliness, with the samples quickly becoming airborne. After that, it was only a matter of time until the highly infectious spores escaped into the ventilation system. First, people started getting sick with a hacking cough and dizziness as the fungus wormed its way into their lungs. Then they started to forget things like passwords, people's faces, and eventually their own names. Finally, they slipped into a coma and died. Then they got back up. Having killed its host, the fungus, which had been worming its way into the muscles, bones, and brain, reanimated their body, spewing clouds of spores while scampering away to the dark, damp corners of the vault. Slowly, the rest of the facility started to succumb, both to the invisible spores and the lurching monsters that had once been their friends and family. Eventually, the survivors of 22 abandoned the vault, fleeing into the desert. Now only the spore carriers remain sitting in silence, waiting for their next victim to stumble across the Garden of the Dead. Possibly the cruelest vault produced by Vault-Tec, 108 was designed to fail in as many diverse and horrible ways as possible. When the bombs dropped, almost none of the important positions were assigned, leading to a mad scramble to keep order that wasted a good chunk of the vault's resources. Then, only 2 years later, their overseer was diagnosed with brain cancer, which killed him in a matter of months, leaving their community reeling again. If that wasn't enough, the main reactor failed, taking the power grid with it and leaving the 200-plus residents with only the spotty coverage of a woefully underpowered backup system. All the planned failures were having the desired effect, with crisis after crisis taking its toll. By now, tensions were running high, and with no rec room and a fully stocked armory, it seemed like there was only one way to let off all that steam. They wouldn't get the chance, however, as this was the perfect time for the resident genetic abominations from the Vault's cloning wing to break free. Dozens of mentally stunted and vicious clones of a man named Gary got the drop on the stressed and exhausted Vault dwellers, cutting them down with pipes, knives, bats, whatever they could get their hands on. This cloning wing was, of course, designed as yet another point of failure, and was finally what did 108 in. Once they'd finished eating their victims, the Garys simply milled around the destroyed vault, lacking the mental capacity to survive outside its rusting corridors. Vault 112 was designed to test the effects of long-term exposure to the cutting-edge virtual reality loungers which filled the facility. In theory, they would allow the Vault's residents to live out their days in an idealized virtual world instead of the drab concrete bunker every other dweller had to suffer through. In practice, these 85 unfortunate people were placing themselves completely at the mercy of their overseer, Dr. Stanislaus Braun. And after 200 years of simulation, mercy was something Braun had in very short supply. Formerly a brilliant Vault-Tec scientist, responsible for the creation of the miraculous Garden of Eden creation kit, or GEC, The centuries locked in virtual reality had poisoned Braun's already twisted mind. He no longer saw his companions as people, instead using them as pawns to act out his sick fantasies. He broke up marriages, staged accidents, and even killed at random before wiping his victims' minds and doing it all over again. With his godlike control over the simulation, Braun locked the Vault's population in a constant, inescapable cycle of torment, being psychologically tortured, killed, and digitally resurrected endlessly just to stave off the good doctor's boredom. In other vaults, death was the final escape from the nightmare experimentation they suffered through, but in Vault 112, it was an endless, indifferent carousel of pain, with no end in sight. With so many of the Wasteland's vaults offering such horrible fates, it's no wonder that most wanderers avoid them like the plague. Though most now sit silent and rusting or filled with new squatters who don't care about their original purpose, it's hard to shake the thought that their sinister design still somehow lingers. Their once happy and hopeful inhabitants, now nothing more than an echo.